So thanks, Daniel. I'm very grateful for this continuing collaboration with the Kunstmuseum, and it's a particular pleasure and honor to welcome Professor Clark tonight and to introduce him with a few words. It won't be easy to limit myself to a few words. Like most scholars who work on 19th and 20th century art, I'm continuously absorbed in an imaginary conversation with teacher Clark's books and articles. And I have quite a few colleagues, students, and dear friends who are loyal and inspiring partners in this ongoing exchange with and about teacher Clark's writings. Professor Clark, who taught for many years at the University of California at Berkeley and lives in London today, published his first two books in 1973, The Absolute Bourgeois, Artists and Politics in France, 1848-1851, and Image of the People, Gustave Courbet and the 1848 Revolution. These books were followed by The Painting of Modern Life, Paris in the Art of Monet and His Followers in 1984, and Farewell to an Idea, Episodes from a History of Modernism in 1999. These four books have become classics. By this I want to say that it is meaningful, productive, inspiring, and encouraging to read these books more than once and at different moments of your own life and intellectual trajectory. In these books, we can find paradigms of close readings as well as exemplary analysis of art critical discourse. We consult these books to think more thoroughly about key concepts of modernism, such as disenchantment, contingency, or spectacle. And what's most important to me, these books are deep reflections on artistic form. A quote from Farewell to an Idea: "It is the form of our statements and the structure of our visualizations that truly are our ways of world-making, at any rate, the ways that hold us deepest in thrall." And in 2008, in a short text with the title More Theses on Feuerbach, Clark states, "Form aims at truth. Truth is to be understood as an operation on the world, not a set of equivalents to a world in place." Form's operations are situated in the realm of politics as well as in our own subjectivity. In 2005, Clark has contributed to the book Afflicted Powers, Capital and Spectacle in a New Age of War that gives a compelling interpretation of the conflicts that have marked our century. Almost at the same time, he committed himself to look each day at two paintings by Poussin. During this exercise, a veritable exercitium, Clark saw himself confronted with form as acting on the human mind in its finitude. The result of this experiment in art writing is the book The Sight of Death, in my view, his most radical and challenging text. In reading Clark, we also recognize that the history of art is not a linear history, which the closer it comes to our present, the more it matters to us. In his most recent book, Heaven on Earth, published in 2018, he leads us back to early modern art because there, in the paintings of Bruegel, Veronese, and Poussin, we find critical responses to today's impulse or desperation to overcome the world we live in. In 2012, I had already the pleasure to introduce Professor Clark here in Basel. He had come to Basel to discuss his, at the time, most recent book, Picasso and Truth, From Cubism to Guernica. For obvious reasons, I did not have to elaborate on the special significance of Picasso to Basel. In 2012, I would not have thought that we were allowed to assign Camille Pissarro a special place in the history of the Kunstmuseum. I'm very grateful that this has changed thanks to the wonderful exhibition curated by Josef Helfenstein. I'm also very grateful that Professor Clark has accepted our invitation to share with us his thoughts about the artist. Tim, you have profoundly shaped our understanding of Pissarro with the great chapter you dedicated to the artist in Farewell to an Idea. You have also written for the catalog, and now we are very much looking forward to learning about your response to this exhibition. Welcome, and please join me to welcome Teacher Clark.
Well, those introductions were very moving, very extraordinary, and I truly thank both Ralph and Daniel for them. I'll try to live up to the billing. There are a few thank yous to be said. Again, they're truly not formulaic. I really mean them. Thank you to Josef Helfenstein for the exhibition and for the invitation to come and speak. A big thank you to Hans Eckstein and Jella Inkamp, who've been very, very kind all the way through and sort of helping me through. And then finally, an enormous thank you to Olga Oshadsky, who's really just been full of enthusiasm and care at every step of the way. So a few months ago, I found myself standing in the gallery devoted to 19th century French painting at the Fitzwilliam Museum in Cambridge. More than a year had gone by since I'd last had the chance of being in a room full of Monets and Renoirs and Seurat's and Cézannes. I was starved of the experience of art. The room was dazzling. I realized as I stood there that I'd spent more than 60 years under the spell of paintings like these, writing about what they looked like and why they mattered. And here I was, after the COVID confinement, face to face again with the puzzling, astonishing fact. Astonishing because, as happened so often before, I was caught off guard that day, almost scandalized, looking at Renoir's Coup de Vent, this is it, or Degas' Au Café. Caught off guard by the sheer vehemence and certainty of these artists' approach to depiction. I'd forgotten the completeness of their paintings' exposure to the pace of nature or the pathos of everyday life. And puzzling, because as happens each time I begin again to confront this painting in the flesh, as opposed to the non-flesh of its life in reproduction, I feel myself at a loss to explain why its superficiality strikes me as so serious, so deliberate, and sufficient. Why, in other words, in a world like ours, where the terms secular and materialist are invariably brought on as negatives, these paintings, even in their negativity, even in their feeling for the material world's elusiveness or the social world's accidental quality, these paintings go on striking me as the best arguments we have for the secular point of view, for being fully and only in the world of matter and sensation, being in it and only it. The room in the Fitzwilliam contains some paintings by Pissarro. Two of them attracted my notice. One of them is called The Harvest. It is signed and dated 1874. The canvas measures 45 by 65 centimeters, an ordinary, modest Pissarro size. In the Kunstmuseum show, the Maison Bourgeoise at the Hermitage from a year earlier is roughly the same size, just a few centimeters taller. Harvest and haymaking are a central Pissarro subject, of course. Sometimes his treatment of the subject has a pastoral, almost nursery story tenderness to it. The exquisite haystack in the Kunstmuseum show, much more exquisite than this rather crude slide can suggest, but you can see it for yourself. Actually, by the way, there are two haystacks, the second one establishing the distance to the fields towards the right. Haystack, with its playing children on the grass nearby and its ageless couple in the cart, pushes the subject almost towards Corot territory. Corot is an enabling presence in Pissarro. This is Corot in Italy in 1843. The memory of Corot, we might think, allows Pissarro to be charming. But of course, the Fitzwilliam Harvest is short, deliberately short on charm. Even the mother and children group in the foreground, with all the opportunities such a group offers for pathos or sentiment, is in the end an exercise in careful refusal. There's more than enough in the laconic paint marks to establish a play of relationship between the trio, to intimate trust, familiarity, a pattern of reliance and dependability, but not enough to disturb the economy of the whole scene. Economy here meaning plainness, workadayness, with the accent on work, the muteness and evenness and resistance of the material world. A better partner for the 74 Harvest than Haystack, I think, is the landscape at Pontoise that Pissarro painted 2 years earlier, which is in a collection not far away from the Fitzwilliam, as it happens, in Oxford. It is a wonderful, cool foil for the haystack, Pissarro at his understated best. So I use the word understated. You'll see in the next 40 minutes or so that understatement is one of my themes. The two paintings put side by side here for a moment are triumphs, in my view, of controlled lack of emphasis. And they are also, I'm sure, Pissarro at his most intense, his most concentrated, his most implacable. Nature, so his paintings say at their most composed, has not to appeal to us. We have to recognize its resistance to us and our wishes. We have to register its distance from us, the way it shrugs off our best efforts to possess it. I mean, of course, there is an uncanny way in which so much of Pissarro's message resonates grimly, actually, in this second week of COP26. These seem to me Pissarro's subjects, or should I better say, his art seems to me built out of a tension between these qualities, these distances and resistances of nature, and an unavoidable relish for the natural facts in front of him. Nature is beautiful, or can be, and one aspect of its beauty is its simplicity, its fragility. Corot didn't get that wrong. Pissarro is a picture maker, after all. The tiny figures on top of the hay cart at right just absolutely at the right of the Pontoise picture, are cousins of the children on the ground in Haystack. We're all, as we look at pictures, dreaming of a view from some such innocent vantage. And yet, it is the undreamlike in Pissarro that matters most, I think. I hold to that opinion, and I'm encouraged to do so by the fact that it seems to have been the opinion also of no less than Degas. Degas was the first owner of landscape at Pontoise, there on the right. I take seriously his choice of Pissarro at his most unpicturesque. And again, I'm bolstered in interpreting his choice of Pissarro in the way I do by the nature of his other choice of a Pissarro canvas in these crucial early years. By the way, a lecturer in art history always apologizes for the images on the screen, the qualities of his reproduction. I do apologize. Some of them are okay. None of them do justice to Pissarro. Some of them are just placeholders, like this one. The choice Degas made of Pissarro was this painting, Ploughed Fields at Osny. Both of Degas' Pissarros are just a touch smaller than the Fitzwilliam Harvest, 45 by 55 centimeters, but essentially the same unemphatic rectangle. I take Ploughed Fields at Osny to be almost demonstrative in its anti-composition, its refusal of framing, its dispersal of attention, its feeling of nature caught between states and refusing to put on its best face for us. There is a political point to this, by the way. I'm sure that with part of his mind, Pissarro wanted to paint ploughed fields as they appeared to those who ploughed them, although he never fooled himself that he could. We should put Degas' ploughed fields alongside these ploughed fields, painted just 1 year earlier. Here, we suspect, is the imperturbable owner of the rather grand Maison Bourgeoise at the Hermitage. Come up to the top of Les Hauteurs de Loti for the notable view down the road to Rouen. Ploughed field or not, one would show one's little daughter the sweep of the countryside. Compare in your mind's eye the family group in Harvest. Pissarro's class consciousness is, yes, as understated as his view of nature, but nonetheless, it is a constant component of his vision. And it is ironical, this class consciousness, as it had to be for a left-wing bourgeois artist in the 19th century. Not for nothing did the Pissarro family call their big country house at Éragny, Pissarro's base for the last 20 years of his life, Éragny Castle, pronounced in English, I gather, by the way. The house stood opposite, as I remember vividly, opposite a row of peasant cottages, each about 1/10 the size of the Pissarro mansion. I don't doubt, in the case of the picture we're looking at, that the model for the lady with the parasol was Julie Pissarro, Camille's wife. Julie, by the way, would have had her own ideas on the subject. Certainly by the early 1870s, the time of this picture, she had built herself a bourgeois identity. The photograph that survives from the time was presumably staged with her full cooperation. The maid with the afternoon drink in the garden is suitably solicitous. But Julie, we know, was originally herself a maid in Pissarro's parents' service when she first became pregnant by the 33-year-old Camille a decade earlier. Les Auteurs de l'Outil, finally, is also, I suspect, a piece of Pissarro family piety, and deeply felt as such. In 1872, the Pissarro's treasured first daughter, Jeanne, was 7 years old. Whether she was already showing signs of the tuberculosis that would kill her only 2 years later isn't clear, but one suspects she was. The little girl among the furrows looks younger than 7, I take it. The picture is retrospective, maybe. And this too seems characteristic of Pissarro, this dialectic of irony and tenderness. The mother and child, as they had been and wish they could be forever, and the bonne bourgeoise with parasol and long skirts, no doubt getting muddy among the clods. Turn back to the mother and child in Harvest. I doubt they are going home at day's end to a house like Eragny Castle, or the Maison Bourgeoise at the Hermitage, or even the big white house in the background there of Climbing Path at the Hermitage of 1875. Peasants don't live in houses with 4 windows across the second story. Harvest, I'm certain, is a painting deeply concerned with its family groups belonging to the landscape they stand in. They're belonging to it, and it's belonging to them. The terms of that social but also material relationship are what the picture wishes above all to set out. And its determination to do so, to find a way of describing the scene that might ultimately, in a better world, make sense to the mother and her children and be recognized as a bourgeois artist's attempt to frame the scene as the 3 of them experience it. This seems to me the key to the picture's plainness, its understatement. The word I used previously to point to the quality I'm trying to describe was, of course, understatement. I shan't abandon the word, but on its own, of course, it's insufficient. I think we need a word to describe the moment in painting at which understatement takes on a peculiar force, an implacable quality, almost a ferocity of refusal. Never has a landscape been less of a view than Harvest, we may feel. Never has an evenness of color been so dismissive of the picturesque. Never has a picture's tonal range, its lights and darks, its shadows and highlights, been so intent on making the absence of full sunshine take on form. I remember my mother and grandmother eternally complaining that the English summer weather was close. Close meaning heavy and overcast and humid. And close applies to Harvest in all senses of the word. The air is thick, the space walled in, the object world presses into the picture surface almost as if it had left a physical imprint. Fields take on many forms in Pissarro, of course, but often at his best they are felt as enclosures, almost confinements. I don't know which of the details I took in the Fitzwilliam conveys this best. Maybe the stickiness and solidity of the poplars over to the left, with the gray sky twisting through them like a wind. Or maybe the anti-haystack to the right, with its untidy tailing of hay still to be raked and stacked by the mother and the 2 children, one assumes. I've said that Harvest is not a view, it's not scenery. The question occurs then as to Pissarro's specific awareness of what he was refusing to do. How did he understand his own negations? Or did he see them as negations at all? There'll never be a definitive answer to this. Pissarro thought in pictures, and only very rarely did he try to put the deeper intentions of that thinking into words. Never very successfully, and of course he was very well aware that he never put them into words successfully. But two obvious kinds of corroborating evidence are available. We know, for example, that Pissarro was a man of extremely wide reading. He even made his grim way through Volume 1 of Das Kapital, if his son Lucien is to be believed. And he held, of course, unflinching anarchist opinions. No one was less likely to take the peasant subject for granted. He knew it was a battleground on which right and left in the late 19th century, in these opening dangerous years of the Third Republic, fought either for the eternal France of piety and deference, or the still to be realized République des Paysans of 1789. Secondly, to my mind more conclusively, we know that Pissarro was a master of the view, the prospect, the panorama, the grand map of a landscape in the making, when he thought it could be turned to its purpose. Here's a beautiful slide of a Pissarro, which, as one or two people in the audience will know, is owed to a deep lover of Pissarro, friend of some of us, Christopher Campbell, wonderful photographer of painting of this epoch. Look for a moment at this harvest, painted the year before the Fitzwilliams. It's a little bigger than the paintings reviewed so far, 65 by 81 centimeters. And it takes up a stance towards the Pontoise countryside that harks back, I think deliberately, to the full-scale salon canvases of the same stretch of the Vienne Valley that Pissarro had done in the last years before the Franco-Prussian War. What I show you here is essentially the same landscape painted in the pre-war years, viewed from a point further up the slope, with what I take to be the same cluster of houses further to the right, and typically for Pissarro, an unpicturesque gash of quarry face visible, with shed roofs, a tiny gantry, a locomotive puffing smoke. This earlier painting is even bigger than the one done 5 years later, a full meter across, this one. So the industrial details register, and certainly were meant to. The 1873 picture, I go back to it, is less grave and workmanlike, of course. Quarries and goods trains are nowhere to be seen. Even the agriculture looks less regimented and intensive. The strip fields of 1868 are still there, but register as less of a hard-edged jigsaw. Nonetheless, the ambition to map, to detail, almost to narrate the whole pattern of peasant economy remains. Small figures, by the look of them women, are bending to bind sheaves of wheat. A row of stacks stands finished next door. A farm cart heads downhill. There's even a diminutive lady with a parasol again to intimate the landscape's other inhabitants. But I did say intimate. This is pastoral, not anti-pastoral. The world of Pissarro's beginnings as a painter, the restless cancellation of landscape appeal that he perfected in the great banks of the Marne in winter of 1866, this tremendous anti-picturesque, has been put behind him for the moment. But not the basic attitude, the relish for difficult truth. Between banks of the Marne in winter and the Fitzwilliam harvest, there is a real continuity, I believe, even if the ghost of Courbet has been displaced by that of Monet. A Monet always to be refuted and resisted at the same time as one learned from his indispensable lightness. Let me move towards the Monet comparison, it can't be avoided, by another route. The second painting by Pissarro at the Fitzwilliam that seems to me Pissarro at his inimitable best is this one. A snow scene painted at the village of Montfoucauld in the winter of 1874. It is again a typical Pissarro mid-size, 46 by 56 centimeters, the same height as Harvest, just a little less wide. You'll see from the angle of my photograph, for which I apologize, that the painting is hung high up in the Fitzwilliam above a much slighter Pissarro from the 1880s. And this I found is often the way with Pissarros in museums. It seems hard to decide which Pissarros should take pride of place. I think that's because the painter's complete successes, like this one in my view, are often paintings most ruthlessly lacking in incident or painterly panache. Because aesthetic dignity and aesthetic austerity are so closely linked in Pissarro's case, it goes on being difficult, even after a century, to sort out a Pissarro canon. I like that fact, of course, and I think Pissarro would have liked it. I say in the essay that I wrote for the Kunstmuseum catalogue that, here's the quote, Cezanne, like any true admirer of Pissarro, secretly thought that Pissarro's great limitation as an artist was that he didn't seem himself to know when he had produced a masterpiece, or, crucially, didn't seem willing ever to do the masterpiece again, to produce brilliant variations on it. He was the anti-Monet in this. I still think this is true, and one side of me, of course, like any admirer of Pissarro, shares Cezanne's admiring impatience. I look at a completely realized and luminous Pissarro, like Climbing Path at the Hermitage, done the summer following Snow at Montfoucauld. I look at its mixture of point-by-point animation and utter evenness of focus. I look at the enigmatic slope of the path to the right and the astonishing play of light and foliage across the roof close to us. I admire Pissarro's utter certainty about how much of distance and brighter sunlight he was prepared to admit in the glimpse of the village through the gap in the trees to anchor the flicker and ambiguity of the foreground. I look at all this, and part of me looks with Cezanne's eyes. I wish Pissarro had done more paintings like this one. I have no doubt that part of the purpose of Cezanne's Côte de Bœuf, in the show, of course, upstairs, wonderful painting, a painting that's very hard to date, and I believe it's not done in 1870s, or it was begun in 1877, but I believe it was finished, definitely finished a few years later. I look at this, and I have no doubt that part of Cezanne's purpose here was to make peace with Climbing Path. Look at the two of them side by side. And in general, Cezanne learns immensely from Pissarro canvases of the climbing path kind. He wants more of them. He does more of them as the years go on. All of this is true. The story of Cezanne as Pissarro's best viewer, best interpreter, this story never stops being worth retelling. Cezanne's view of what mattered most in Pissarro's paintings is one we all go on learning from. But it is, I also want to argue, a partial one. It doesn't quite take the measure of Pissarro's ironic imperfection. What Cezanne sees, rightly, in Pissarro is the sotto voce coherence, the underlying structure, the holding across the whole surface of a complex single chord. I'm very sorry this is so dark, but you'll see it for real upstairs. His Pissarro, to choose an example from the show, is the composer, the solidifier of the great palette knife pictures of 1874 and thereabouts. But there is and has to be another Pissarro whose approach to depiction puts this one in doubt. Nature is orderly, but also disorderly. It is beautiful and ugly. It is delightful and it is dreary. The sun shines and the rain pours down. Snow is pure and electric, transfiguring the landscape. Snow is obdurate and everlasting, muffling the shapes of things, exuding a crude, cold half-light. Snow turns white to gray. When someone I showed the Fitzwilliam snow scene said that he thought it was the coldest painting he'd ever seen, I think he paid the picture a compliment Pissarro would have loved. I remembered a poem by Pissarro's New England contemporary, Emily Dickinson. The sky is low, the clouds are mean, a traveling flake of snow across a barn or through a rut debates if it will go. A narrow wind complains all day how someone treated him. Nature, like us, is sometimes caught without her diadem. Of course, there are dangers to the anti-picturesque. What is a painting to be if not picturesque? It's easy to sneer at the word, and we all have our memories of landscapes that crowd on effects and incidents and acts of easy reverence for the simple life. I never tire of quoting another much closer contemporary of Pissarro on this subject. Here's the poet Charles Baudelaire writing to a friend in 1853. You ask me for verses for your little collection. Some verses about nature, is that it? Verses with woods and great oak trees in them, and greenery and insects, no doubt the sun. But you know full well that I am incapable of tenderness towards vegetables, and my spirit rebels against this shocking new religion. I shall never believe that the soul of the gods lives in plants, and even if it did live there, it wouldn't interest me in the slightest. And I'd go on considering my own soul a thing of far higher price than that of a set of sanctified vegetables. Indeed, I've always thought that there was in nature, always flowering and renewing itself, something oppressive, grim, cruel, something on the edge of impudence, incapable of tenderness towards vegetables. Baudelaire's phrase goes on resonating. Of course, it resonates in such a complex, ironic way in our present. Pissarro, we know, more than once described himself as a painter of cabbages. The ones in the foreground of Degas' ploughed field are tremendous. The ones in the foreground of the Thyssen cabbage field, one of the show's chief glories, I feel, are even better. The English language has the grand word plethoric, taken into Middle English from the Greek, to describe the late summer condition of vegetables of this kind, inflated, turgid, full to excess. Pissarro's oil paint in the Thyssen picture is determined to materialize that condition. I think Pissarro believes art should engage with the life of vegetables, certainly. They are a better subject than heroes or history or even les fleurs du mal. This is part, I think, of Pissarro's deep, bitter cultural pessimism, which is hard to come to terms with in someone also so gentle, but it's there, it's fundamental. Fundamental is his conviction that the ideals of bourgeois society, its claims to higher life, were bogus. That's why I'm a painter of cabbages. I'm a painter of cabbages. Of course it would be better to be a painter of the tennis court oath or the retreat at Marignano. But such subjects, the making of a nation, courage, unanimity, social purpose, collective action, such subjects have been debauched by the artistic and moral fakery of our whole declining century. So, cabbages it has to be. Cabbages standing for the remaining reality of men and women's struggle with the realm of necessity. The men and women back there in the gloom. But do I feel tenderness for cabbages? I'm still trying to ventriloquize Pissarro's unspoken credo. Are these vegetables sanctified? Certainly not. Tenderness there may be, or some kind of endless astonishment and rueful fascination for what nature offers the eye, if we allow ourselves to see it. Tenderness may be for light. Tenderness sometimes, but at others surely an attitude that is more like grim submission, horrified but also elated obedience to the facts out there. This brings us back to the Fitzwilliam Snow scene. You'll gather that I think it's one of Pissarro's masterpieces, and also that I cannot escape, and I don't want to escape, from the feeling that the enormously high value I put on it may be absurd. For it's not a painting of anything, or anything much. It's not a painting that has seized on a structure, or an order, or a hidden beauty or humanity in the world that confronts it. It seems, on the contrary, to want to tell us that no such structure or humanness is there. There may be beauty. There is beauty. There is beauty in the indiscriminateness, the muffling, the chill moisture in the air, the unlovely attempt at making a path through the snow at the edge of the field. And the beauty has called out astonishing new behaviors of paint to describe it. Of course, Pissarro is ultimately an aesthete. It's the fact that really looking at a sky like the one at Montfoucault, has elicited something as perfect and unprecedented as that series of blunt smears of grey up there to the right of the central tree, that it's given rise to such an amazing conjuration of distance and stillness and more bad weather to come. It's enabled this unique kind of balance between the being of paint as paint and the being of paint as a state of the atmosphere. It's the payoff for painting, of course, of the anti-picturesque. That's what makes the game worth playing for him. But it's a hard game. Remember the description of landscape painting offered at the start of the 19th century by the Englishman John Constable, of course a revered hero of Pissarro and Monet and the rest. I quote, "It is the business of a painter not to contend with nature in all its plenitude, but to make something out of nothing." I think Constable means here the incidental, the overlooked, the odd fact that the eye just happens to notice. Make something out of nothing, in attempting which he must almost of necessity become poetical. Wonderful quote. And it has to be a poetry of the nothing, with the nothing always threatening to overtake the poetry. Painting shouldn't poeticize the snow. Unloveliness, if it's to mean anything at all in art, has to admit its near neighborhood to dreariness, or ugliness, or nondescriptness. All this, as I say, is dangerous. Dreariness might well take over. Pissarro is a painter always trying to paint his way out of established identities. He wants not to know, while he's painting, what snow is, or what a winter sky looks like, or how a cottage hides, almost skulks behind a tangle of branches. That's basic to his ethics. Painting is a way of not knowing again. But the game has risks. Refusal of the identities the mind gives us. Pissarro refuses them because he believes our minds are full of untruths foisted on us by our upbringing and social duties. Refusal of those identities is hard to distinguish in practice from endless equivocation or from simple vagueness. The closer we get to a great Pissarro of this kind, the greater the tension. Is the slather of white and the smudge of grey-brown pathway a triumph of registration or a piece of painterly slapdash? Is the far roof behind the trees actually there in vision, finally? Are those almost black, stunted branches, the ones whose ends seem to have been broken off by the weather, are they really branch-like? I'd say a positive yes to all three questions. For me, the snow sticks coldly to my fingers, and the house looms in the murk, and the branches fight for life. But only just in all three cases. And I haven't a clue as to how they make a mess of paint. Stay messy, stay sullen, but do the work of illusion so completely. I said many minutes ago that I would face the inevitable comparison with Monet. And I realize I haven't done so yet. Although really, Monet has been shadowing everything I've said for the last 10 minutes or so. But here's the comparison explicitly. It's a cruel comparison, but cruel to whom, ultimately? Monet is painting at Argenteuil, the suburb to the west of Paris, which he'd recently made his home. That's his house and studio, the tall villa to the right with the blue shutters. The picture is usually dated 1875. It may even be later the same winter as the Pissarro. This is Monet at his incandescent best. He's incomparable. Pissarro could never have done a blinding, booming winter like this. A winter in which everything is surface, is whiteness, a hand's breadth away from the eye. And nature can be like this. Paint can justifiably revel in its transfiguring power. When the great art critic Félix Fénéon rounded on Monet a few years later, he famously had this to say: Monsieur Claude Monet is a spontaneous painter. The word impressionist was made for him. He is immediately moved by a spectacle. Actually, the French is really much more unkind. Il s'émeut brusquement à un spectacle, with the implication that he works up an emotion for artistic purposes. But there is nothing in Monsieur Monet of the contemplative or analytic. He has a propensity to make nature grimace in order to prove that the moment is unique and we shall never see its like again. I think, don't mistake me here, that the sheer presence of the snow in Monet shrugs off Fénéon's criticism. This isn't nature grimacing, it's nature coming to us, breaking through our perceptual defenses. But nonetheless, there is an underlying thought in Fénéon's unkind criticism that will never entirely go away. Painting for Monet is spectacle. It is an image coming forward to meet us, collapsing distance, bathing everything in one striking, irresistible light. When Pissarro came to think about Monet in 1891, admiringly, but with doubts in his letters, he slipped into describing all the Monet haystacks on show that year as couchers de soleil, sunsets, snowscapes, light glittering on rippling water. Monet waits, as it were, for those moments when nature herself becomes pictorial. He's certainly not interested in those long, ordinary moments when, I quote Emily Dickinson again, the sky is low, the clouds are mean, a traveling flake of snow across a barn or through a rut debates if it will go. And this is where the comparison with Pissarro truly begins. For of course, nature isn't pictorial most of the time. It is only rarely, maybe never, a spectacle. It isn't ours. It doesn't come to meet us. We impose an order on it only painfully. It will, we hope, survive our worst doings. We should be prepared to be disappointed by nature, to be chilled by it. There is a beauty to its separateness. And this is Pissarro's nature. This is Pissarro's art. For paint shouldn't be pictorial all the time. Paint, in its effort to reach out to nature's otherness, should be prepared to be unmoved, unmoving, not at all in the service of emotion. You'll be saying, very reasonably, that this doesn't sound like a recipe for painting pleasure. A world of whites and greys, like the one we're looking at, is not one we'd want to be confined to, still less to seek out in an art gallery. No doubt, children also play under the haystack in Pissarro. Jeanne and her mother stand in the furrows. There is a constant to and fro in Pissarro, as there had to be, between the nondescript and the charming, or the unprecedented and the all too familiar. I want to end on a high point, and I realize there are many in the present show. About one or two of them I've had my say in the catalogue, about the cabbage field come from Madrid, or the grand Côte de Boeuf from London. I hope you'll forgive me if I return to a painting I've shown you already, and that isn't part of the Kunstmuseum show, the climbing path at the Hermitage in the Brooklyn Museum. I will say, as a heartbroken aside, that it's never on display in the Brooklyn Museum, which speaks to something in our culture. I talked previously about climbing paths' extraordinary spatial structure, its elusive slope, its screen of leaves, the intricacy of its interruptions and glimpses into distance. I made the case for its effect on Cezanne, but I didn't really face the question of climbing paths' purpose as a painting, its attitude, its sense of life. As always in art that matters, it seems to me difficult to disentangle that sense of life from painting's sense of art, its attitude to what it's doing in representing the world at all. What the point of the strange exercise called picturing might be. I know that such things don't often get put into words because it's hard to do so. This way too often lies empty rhetoric or bad philosophy. Nonetheless, I go on wanting art writing to make the attempt. Over the past few years, I found myself writing some poems about paintings, and one of them is about climbing path. I'll end by reading it. It's quite short. It tries to find words for what the equality of focus in Pissarro, the evenness of attention, might be meaning to tell us about the world we have, and the world we might have if we took painting as our guide. Pissarro is always thinking about that. Everything I point to in the poem is obvious, I think, except perhaps a mention of the soft, grinning skull. That's my metaphor. I'm not sure how to make the yes, that's my metaphor for that wonderful dark moment of the shadowed rock there, interlocking with the roof far below, almost like sort of slotted into it. Always in Pissarro, at his best, I think, there are these moments of strangeness folded into the evenness and ordinariness and clarity. Here's the poem. Climbing path. The curtain falls. The show of the world is over. It would be too easy to call the scene on the curtain a room, for the coolness of color, the shivering of everything in a wind, the greens and yellows turning their undersides to an energy, even the purple darkness clinging to the summit of a cliff, are the outside epitomized. And the path up the hill, though it does not take the ground from under anyone's feet, does lead away with that promise of happiness Pissarro half believed in, more than half, brush in hand, toward a state in which order and freedom, the kind summed up by the spec-built cottages, flutter out everywhere, evenly, availably. Birds hardly bothered by a morning stroller, wings repeating the plash of a palette knife, birch trees rushing to a rendezvous, moss meeting the top of a tiled roof and becoming the soft grinning skull and the shimmering lake. A dream of painting, endless painting, never green too many. Each unfortunate villa bathed in the light of the universe. Thank you.